Welcome to the fourth episode of Do Not Flush. Today, we have a very interesting guest. We're going to be talking about EQ. We're going to be talking about DEI. I know it's a hot topic right now. We're going to be talking about leadership and lack thereof in tech, what that looks like. We're also going to be talking about the need to sometimes slow down and why boredom could be a good thing, and how it could actually help you to grow and improve uh, alongside mental health benefits. I'm joined with Chris. I've had the pleasure of working with Chris in the past. He comes in from the tech background, and not just any tech background, worked with some of the most cutting edge technology and artificial intelligence and whatnot, and then made a major pivot and is now helping people in a different way. And Chris, do you mind to give us a quick a preview or background on what you do now and the kind of pivot you've gone through?
Yeah, happy to. And first, congrats on launching this and doing this work. This is a great forum and some great conversation so far. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here with you. Yeah, I was in tech sales for about a decade, for 10 years. I kind of stumbled into that because I had some life situations happen and kind of took me off my vocational path, and it just became a good fit. And it was around pandemic time that my older brother actually entered medical school when he was 40 years old. So this was a couple years before the pandemic. When he did that, it opened up my imagination to, oh wait, I can do whatever I want to do vocationally. And so therapy has been a big part of my life since 2011. That's when I moved to Durham. And today I'm still working with the same therapist. And the changes, the growth, the healing I've experienced in my life through some very difficult pieces I've gone through. And um, that work, when I started imagining, oh, I could do that work with people too, that's really what motivated me to become a therapist. So I went back to grad school and yeah, opened up my own practice.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great. Oh, glad that we're very happy to have you here today. So, emotional intelligence. I think this is a really kind of a big topic that I've been hearing about a lot recently. Does it have a real impact, or is it just a corporate buzzword? We had some critics that argue that emotional intelligence is overemphasizing the things at the expense of competency and decision-making ability. Some research that suggests that too much focus on EQ can make leaders indecisive and prioritize harmony over performance.
Mm.
Others kind of talk about whether EQ is actually predictive of leadership success, arguing that it lacks a standardized measurement. And some even argue that narcissists and aggressive traits, which low EQ leaders often have, can be effective in high pressure business environments.
Mm.
So let's talk about that. So first off, do you agree, disagree, in between? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of pieces there that we could unpack for multiple episodes. Um, I think my experience in the business world and in tech in particular, EQ was this additional certification I could get to add to my skill set. So that was my experience. The conversation was, oh, you're good in your role. Well, let's talk about adding on EQ, or if leaders who are leading uh, divisions, VPs, or the C-suite that's leading an organization, if they just added EQ on, then they may be more effective leaders. And I just think that's missing what EQ is. I think EQ is central to what it means to be a human being in the world. So I would define EQ as the ability to identify what I'm experiencing in a moment emotionally,
Okay.
validate that, and have compassion on it myself. And we can talk about what that looks like. And then use that information to inform how I interact and communicate with other people. And so at its core, again, this is a skill central to being a grounded, centered human being. Um, so, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a number of things I of course, a narcissistic leader can achieve results and be effective with some results. Um, I don't think that's going to lead to an organizational growth and success.
So you're saying a low EQ leader could see success in a middle management role, maybe where they're responsible, or where their responsibilities are limited, but maybe on a top management level, EQ is required. Would you?
Ideally, I think a CEO that doesn't have the skills I defined with EQ can still increase a bottom line, and can still lead an organization to increasing a bottom line. The question is that the most effective growth this organization can see? And there's a lot of research coming out now, especially around like the 4-day work week, um, that's pointing to productivity increases and um, organizational success is really dependent on human flourishing. And that's a fascinating pivot from increasing productivity, either for an executive design to increase productivity within the organization through um, positive and negative reinforcement, for example.
So I like the concept of, are you saying that EQ should not be an afterthought? It should be part of the foundation of who you are professionally. Um, and that is how would somebody go about that? When at what stage would somebody start to take that into consideration and start bringing it to the surface? And how would somebody go about you know um, developing the skills around it?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. EQ is not something, again, that's reserved for the business space and helping professionals navigate their work lives better. Um, the skills, identifying what I'm experiencing in a moment, validating it, having compassion on it, and then using that to inform how I communicate, that happens in every interaction in our lives. So it's happening with you and I right now. And it happens in intimate relationships, it happens in friendships. Um, so let me play it out on how it could show up, not just in the professional setting, but as part of our everyday life and experience. If you say something here that makes me feel a certain way, let's say it's something that makes me angry, and I'm unaware, or I'm unable to validate my feeling of anger, or recognize it even, because anger isn't something I know how to recognize within myself. Then I may start responding to you based on that internal feeling. If I'm able to recognize, and that may not match what's happening, I may not be able to interact with you in a really authentic way because my actions are being driven by this internal experience I'm having. If I've developed my EQ to a sense of, okay, I'm angry. Michael said something that made me angry. Oh, that's connected to this part. I just had an argument with my partner before I left to come here, and it's reminding me of that. It gives me clarity of how to then interact with it. Interesting. And so you can see how these skills are necessary in a professional setting, in a business setting, but they're skills that have to be developed in one's entire life. Um, you asked how they're developed. Um, I think therapy is an incredible place to do that, um, because that's an environment. Therapy can be like a petri dish where we can try on new ways of interacting with ourselves, with another person in the room who's trained and skilled to walk us through these skills, and getting them, and then they can eventually become skills that we implement in all of our lives, including work life.
So you mentioned that like sometimes in this interview where EQ is being applied,
Mhm.
but I could argue that I've seen sometimes where there's like interviews where the interviewer on purpose is ab- has an ability to bef- because they have a low EQ are able to ask very maybe provoking questions to get to the truth of a matter, for example. And
Mhm.
in that case, I could argue that EQ or lack of EQ has enabled that person to advance in their job. Would you agree with that statement? Or
Yeah, I don't think asking a provoking question or even a confrontational question means that it's coming from a place of low EQ. Um,
I should say they're ignoring they might be aware of
Mhm.
the ramifications of the question, how it's going to be perceived,
Mhm.
the emotional reaction that's it's going to bring out.
Yeah,
But they still ask it anyways.
I don't think that's low EQ.
It's not low EQ, but
Mhm.
avoiding it. So that's a
Mm,
situation where EQ is not existent on a surface level
mm,
that is helping this interviewer
mhm.
to advance their career. So in that case, I could argue that EQ would or practicing EQ on the surface would be bad.
How and define for me what practicing EQ would look like in that scenario.
Well, if practically, look, let's say somebody's interviewing someone, they believe that that person might not be genuine, or they believe that they're trying to hide something, they're trying to avoid maybe hurting somebody else because of what they might say, but the reporter is genuinely trying to get to the bottom of the situation.
Mhm.
Practicing low EQ and pressing that person to the point of let's call it breaking point, and then having them to be upfront and honest about something gets the reporter the information they need, which then helps them advance their career. But in reality, they didn't practice EQ.
Yeah, I would still, disagree with the same they're not practicing EQ. If they're aware, um, of what they're engaging in, trying to provoke response or, confront, I think th where it would be evident whether EQ was present in this conversation is more on the respondent, and if they simply are reacting out of the intrinsic emotional experience, as opposed to recognizing where does emotional experience connect with me, and if I'm angry, I can still respond out of that anger or out of that frustration, but it's being aware of those experiences and not letting them drive us subconscious.
I like it. So basically, I was thinking of EQ as something that I would need practice, but it's also could be when I'm receiving information, I could be also practice EQ to help me navigate the situation. I also agree with you. Is it's not that EQ is not present with the interviewer, is that they maybe used it in, I should say, in a negative way or in a self-serving way.
Mhm. Sure.
You know?
Yeah.
So it is so basically in a way we can I guess we could argue that EQ is good even if you're not going to use it. You still would need EQ because it could still help you navigate your career in a way. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think EQ is necessary if you're not aware of the internal experience, and again, I'm repeating
Yeah.
this because this is central to EQ in my opinion. If you're not aware of an internal experience, you're gonna be driven by these forces that you don't understand, and it's not gonna give you the agency you want in your life to make decisions based on your values, your goals, um, the places you wanna make decisions from.
So basically you're saying that EQ is required regardless of your position, regardless of whether you're on the receiving end or the transmitting end. It is something that is should be practiced and fostered from the beginning of your career, if not before that. And it does not exclude you or does not exclude the your ability if you're in a leadership position to be concise, to be able to provide very maybe a firm instructions and being able to push someone to get maybe their job done as long as it's in a professional manner versus kind of so because I hear a lot of arguments saying EQ makes kind of like you're more concerned about people's feelings than you are about you doing your job. What you're saying is that no, that's not necessarily true. You could still be focused on the job, and you might realize sometimes you are pushing someone. It's kind of like a tough love in a way.
Mm.
You can practice tough love, but you still need EQ, is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's helpful for you to ask it that way because if you remember the way I define EQ is more based on the experience of the self, not the experience of the other. So EQ it affects how we interact and communicate with others. But I live in the world of psychology and psychotherapy. There is a lot of distress and challenges that come into people's life when they're disconnected from their internal experience. Um, the technical term is dissociation. And when somebody is not connected to what am I experiencing emotionally, what am I thinking, how does my body feel? Because all these systems are connected and give us information about that. Um, that creates a lot of distress and a lot of problems and challenges. So yeah, EQ is not about pretending everything's happy with everybody you interact with.
It's
What
mindfulness,
what
essentially.
I it is connected
Buddhist approach to mindfulness.
because the situation described, the leader who needs to be firm. I work with clients and I interact with people in my daily life who, because they're not in tune with their internal experience, they don't know how to ask for what they want.
No.
And so the 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 executive, the VP, even the manager who is let's take in the positive route, is connected to what they're experiencing emotionally in a situation and why that's present, they can then determine, okay, here's what I want to ask for, and here's what I need in this situation. And it can be clear. Um, this is also true for parents. And parents who can manage their own internal experience, emotional experience, children feel freed in that home of having to manage it for the parents. And so EQ is simply that ability to recognize and manage my own internal emotional experience and let that inform how I interact with.
I love it. So basically, to kind of sum this up, your EQ is not about how you are perceived or how you are worried about being perceived. It's more about your. It's all about you. It's
Yep.
about your ability to be aware, mindful of your emotions and your position, and then be able to apply the right decision making and use of language and this level of assertiveness needed for the situation, even if sometimes that does call for you being decisive and assertive in a situation. I think this is a very novel perspective, and I never thought of it that way. That's brilliant, Chris. I really appreciate you bringing that up. So, kind of, unless you have any other final thought,
I mean, we can talk about it. Yeah.
forever. No, it was great. I mean, I know that in the past, I've just as you were talking, I remember situations where one or two times somebody would come to me and give me feedback, say that was kind of low in EQ what you had said to that person or that person, and I would go back and reflect on it, and I would realize that you know it can be perceived as having been a low EQ remark, but it's and what I found out is because it was perceived that way because that person did not know where I was coming from.
Mm.
They did not understand. I thought I misunderstood,
Mhm.
and this kind of goes back to what you're saying, having being mindful of like where you are in the situation. I misunderstood. I thought that person knew where I was coming from, knew my intentions were never negative. I had just simply was approaching, let's call it a situation with efficient communication,
Mhm.
but that was not perceived that way.
Mm.
I misunderstood the cues, social cues of that person, and to think that they understood where I was coming from. They understood I was not being trying to be negative or hurtful, but that wasn't the case. But also, then I realized in some cases, person on the receiving end can have their own, let's call it, maybe for lack of a better term, you might have a actual the proper term for it, but they have baggage, and you coming in doing something that is completely innocent, that is very respectable or respectful, and coming in with an approach that is professional, but the way they perceive it, because of whatever predisposition they have, that causes them to see it as very negative or low EQ, and then kind of have ramifications in the workplace. So, but this kind of goes back to, like, you just, I guess, it's nothing is perfect. You're gonna come across a situation where these kind of interactions are gonna happen, and you just have to work through them.
And I love how you just talked through that scenario. We all have baggage. In every interaction in our lives, we're bringing in baggage. Baggage might not be bad, it might not be big, it might not be even disruptive, but it's all there. And so another way of naming it is, are we aware of our baggage in any communication and situation? So in what you just painted, you interact with somebody, they're bringing baggage into it. EQ is the ability for that person to recognize, oh, wait a second, that's hitting on some baggage here that might not have to do with Michael, and it might not have to do with this interaction. And so if they can recognize that, then they can have a more authentic interaction with you, and you not get the brunt of the baggage in the conversation. Beautiful. Love it.
The next topic, which I know is very hot right now,
Mhm.
and I know it's a very divisive, unfortunately, topic. I want to kind of touch on it a little bit. I know the next episode, I also have another guest is going to go really deep into it, but um, diversity. We've seen a lot of companies roll back some of their DI initiatives with concerns of, things like reverse discrimination, or just because of political activism, and they're afraid of how that could harm their bottom line. And some critics argue that there's too much focus on identity rather than skills and contributions, which can lead to resentment and tokenism. Others suggest that we should focus more on diversity of thought, not identity-based diversity. And honestly, I personally can argue that it should be a balance. There's bits and pieces from here and there. I don't think I wouldn't put myself in one camp or another. I see some merits to both sides of the arguments. Just curious on what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah. Growing up as a white male in primarily white environments, um, I don't have the experience to speak to um, how DEI affects people who are on the underside of power in this conversation and in this country. Um, Historically, my family has not had to navigate challenges that others, and my black friends, um, my trans friends have had to navigate. So again, yeah, I have a voice, but I think it's more important to prioritize the voice of those who have experiences um, in this country, in particular, in this context, that their lives have been affected by
So
the way our society is structured around this.
I agree. I agree with you there. Though this is more of the kind of the workplace, right? So I do believe everybody should have a voice. It's kind of goes back to the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, and the ability to convey your point of view, as long as you are being respectful and not, threatening anybody. You have a right to say what's on your mind, and everybody should have the ability to do so. What this is more of a concern is that are we losing meritocracy losing its hold in the workplace? So if somebody comes to you and says, like, I'm the best person for this job, but they then claim that they've lost that job or they haven't been able to get that job because they didn't happen to be of this right gender or age or race. What's your take on if they are the perfect person for the job?
Mhm.
I think that's where kind of where the gap starts to take place.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, a perfect person for the job is also, a subjective assessment by whomever is doing that. Um, yeah, where my mind goes is the reason that DEI initiatives have been put in place, um, especially in the past 5 to 10. I mean, there's work before this, but come to the front of society in the past 5 to 10 years. Um, and that's some of that reality is because of, again, the dynamics I was alluding to when talking about my voice versus the voice of somebody who looks different than me and has a different experience in this country than me. I mean, we live in a country where being white has had its benefits for people, and so when people are interviewing for a job, and we're assessing, well, if they're the right fit, should they get it? That's one piece of this conversation. The other pieces are, let me illustrate this through a quick anecdote.
Yeah.
Um, I was listening to a podcast, and this podcast was an interview with a scholar in the UK who is arguably acknowledged. A lot of people acknowledge him as top of his field. He's mid to late 70s. He's taught at Oxford. He's held high advisory positions in UK government, England, and a lot of leadership roles. A lot of people say he's a really successful person. He's written a lot of books, articles. His opinion is desired. So we're looking like, yeah, he's successful. In this podcast interview, he was talking about how his earliest memory um, is of him as a young boy growing up in the UK, sitting in a room and just recognizing how surrounded by love he is within his family and support, and his community as well. Um, then I think about my clients who tell me that their earliest memory that they can remember as a human being involves terrible and horrific experiences of abuse. And so whether they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, life is very difficult for them. Um, every day seems to be a struggle. They haven't been able to pursue the things they wanted to pursue. So if we look at these two individuals, and I said clients, I'm thinking of a few white clients, and this scholar is also white. If we just look at that scenario, we're recognizing they start from different places,
Okay.
and it makes sense to most people why the the person I'm describing over here, whose life started with a memory of abuse, struggles with confidence. Of course, they're not going to be able to take the risks that the scholar took in his 20s or 30s, because risk for this person has meant different things. And so, in the way that we can acknowledge that those two beginnings have affected the direction of their lives, that also can be applied to conversations of race in this country, um, gender in this country, sexual orientation in this country. And that's why the conversation of DEI in business um, needs to be expanded beyond just is is this the perfect person to hire or not?
But you mentioned in the workplace, why would you know? as a society, I agree with you. We should be able to try to give everyone the this basic rights that need to be in place. There, we should be as a society make sure that we help our fellow man. And even whether you're secular or religious, a lot of a lot of folks would agree with that statement. Though, is it the place of a manager looking to hire somebody for a job to come in and say, "This is how I'm going to be help doing my part," or shouldn't it be on society to come and try to take make put efforts in place to help these people?
Mhm. Yeah, let me give you an example from my field.
Okay.
Since we're talking about the business world and professional
Yeah.
setting. Um, one area of focus in my work as a therapist is trauma and PTSD.
Okay.
And when you look at the history of research around trauma and PTSD and treating PTSD and CPSD, which stands for complex, and let me define PTSD as post traumatic stress disorder. Um, And let me define trauma just for those that may be engaging this that aren't familiar. Trauma is simply an experience or a series of experiences that, when we're in the moment, it is too intense for us to experience. So our brains actually file it away in an inaccessible place. So we're not able to feel the emotions of that moment. Um,
Immediately archive it.
Correct.
That's the tech.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which goes back to the dissociation, disconnection I referred to earlier. Um, so this is something I work with. Um, Now, research around PTSD and CPTSD and treating it in the US really uh, took off in the 1970s following the Vietnam War. We had had multiple wars and we had people come home from them and have trauma and PTSD symptoms. But in the 70s, is when psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and researchers began uh, noticing, oh, there are threads to these experiences, similar threads. Well, every experience is contextual and different. There's similar responses, similar things we're noticing. So one of the leading researchers at that time, a man named Bessel van der Kolk, and he in the VA started working with these veterans and noticing this disconnection that we named and talked about. So he then said, well, let me try doing something to reconnect people with their bodies. And so he started leading veteran yoga groups and found that the experience of somebody who's been through a traumatic situation, simply having an experience where they're connected with their body, uh, can be one piece in their healing and integration of that traumatic experience. And he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. A lot of people are familiar with it. Um, and that research has been very helpful. Peter Levine is another person that came around to kind of support this conclusion that somatic work, so work focused on the body, is one key piece of treatment and work when you're dealing with trauma. Bessel van der Kolk is a Dutch psychiatrist. He's a white male. Peter Levine is also a white male. So these two white males identified in the 1970s that an ancient practice that's millennia old that originated in India can actually serve to help heal and begin integration from a traumatic experience. What they discovered wasn't new, and it had been discovered in other cultures. Um, it just felt new because it was positioned in the way that they did. Another example in that area of trauma and PTSD is some of the most exciting research right now is around the use of two medicines, psilocybin and MDMA, which are considered psychedelics and the psychedelic family. Psychedelic assisted
Mushrooms therapy.
mushrooms contain psilocybin. And the research in the US is actually ramping up so much, the leading researcher, Robert Carr Harris, moved from London College to University of California, San Francisco to continue to lead and grow the research in the U.S. Johns Hopkins has done a lot around this as well. What they're finding is that with uh, psychotherapy leading up to a therapeutic experience with these medicines, and then with some psychotherapy for integration work afterwards, these self-reported benefits are astronomical. In some studies, it's 70 to 90% of people are self-reporting um, decrease in PTSD symptoms, increase in positive symptoms, and uh, and more joy and flourishing in their life. What's fascinating about that is that these medicines have been used in Central American and South American indigenous and African indigenous populations for millennia. So I talk about that to illustrate, if we want to talk about diversity of thought only comes when we bring diverse people into a room together. And had psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, researchers paid attention to other cultures and these practices, then maybe before the 1970s, we would have had some of these treatments in place to help people coming out of World War I or World War II.
Yeah, I think that's a great story, and not story, but the set of your take on some history and the current events. It's very enlightening, and also, recently I heard that ancient Egyptians also used sound therapy, and there's evidence that they use something called sound therapy, which is now considered, cutting edge technology in how to heal the human body. Which it's fascinating. I definitely agree that there's a lot of riches from history that we should take into account, and but as a societal perspective, again, everybody should have a platform because, like you mentioned, there's a lot of human wealth in the story of the human civilization that we should reap the benefits of. I mean, a lot of the current technology right now didn't just start 20 years ago. A lot of what we know about, like, the map that's used in computers, actually started early on, the zeros and ones, I think, in the the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken. So,
Even before that, it was a one, yeah, that yeah,
so
in the 19th century.
so it's we should definitely take advantage of. No one can argue to say having giving everybody equal kind of representation in that manner, in that scene or space, that scale, is a bad thing. I would disagree with that. Going back to my earlier point, shouldn't this be covered as a societal perspective? Shouldn't we strive as a society to say everybody should have equal ability to have same level of education, or same level quality of education, quality of access to opportunity, so that that's the way we should be able to solve the misrepresentation in the workplace, versus kind of put it as an afterthought, like with EQ. People try to put it as an afterthought. It should be something from the very beginning.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I have two main thoughts in response. That's one piece that DEI is seeking to address, which goes back to the point I was trying to make with the scholar and the person who experienced abuse early on is, yes, equal access to resources and education, that's part of DEI, and giving those who are often on the underside of power in our society, on the underside of resources in our society, accessibility. That's absolutely one piece of it. I live in Durham, North Carolina. I think the latest data I saw is 35.8% of residents are Black. Raleigh, I think it's like 27.5% of residents are Black. I worked at 4 software companies that are based in the Raleigh-Durham area, that required employees to be in office, so they weren't hiring remote. And of the sales organizations that I was in, not one of those had 5% of the sales staff that were Black. So, yeah, that speaks to one of the reasons these DI initiatives are important. That doesn't make sense based on what we're talking about. The other dynamic, though, that we have to name is, and you alluded to this, but yeah, positions should be based on merit, but too often white people are put in positions where they have not earned it, or don't have the merit behind them to deserve that position. This is happening in Trump's administration. It happened in 2016 when he put his children in charge of things that many people believe they're not qualified for. Um, the defense secretary nomination of this term. These are conversations going on. So this happens all the time. It's not just in the Trump administration where white people, often white males, are put in positions that they haven't earned or deserved, and that's the other important piece. I mean, there's lots of important pieces, but those are two important pieces of DEI initiatives.
It should be a mindful thing. Should it be dictated at an organizational level? Because there's the folks that argue to say, well, this is causing, like I cited before, some resentment by some employees to feel like maybe that person, that position, because they don't deserve it or they're not as don't have the same merits. But then you also argued that in some cases that could also apply to a majority instead of a minority part of the community. So what could be there? What's this? Is there a solution to this? How can we solve for? How can we guarantee uh, diversity and guarantee reap the benefits of it, which no question there are benefits to it, and have it applied in the right place and right position,
Mhm.
and make sure that as an organization, we're also helping shape our community at a macro level to make sure that these we have things from the get go, from the ground up, this is positioned in a manner that will help us to, in a way, make DEI obsolete in a good way. That this no longer needed because everybody has the same opportunities. Everybody has got the chance to, you know, do what they're truly passionate about, what they have an ability for, and go from there. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think this is where we need to listen to the voices of the Nicole Hannah Jones, who was at UNC for a while, is now at Howard University. Ibram X. Kendi, um, Clint Smith, um, who wrote "How the Word Was Passed." These are all um, people that are more adept to speak towards. At first, there I would never say here's the solution or here's how to solve it, but I would say it begins um, with listening to those voices. Anina Turner, who was a congresswoman in Ohio, from Ohio. She's an incredible voice around these initiatives and how they make sense in a larger scale society. So that's how I would respond to that. Again, this is where, yeah, I may have opinion or voice, but my voice isn't the one that needs to lead this conversation.
Okay, but do you believe that diversity of thought is something that should also be put as a priority? And I know you mentioned diversity of thought comes in organically by having folks from different backgrounds, but
Mhm.
I felt in the last few years where even folks from a minority group that had a different opinion from the mainstream side of things were silenced in a way.
Mm.
So, would you say that DAI does still need to itself grow as a movement in the sense of ensuring that diversity of thought might that the differing opinion might come from somebody that looks just like you, even if you are in a minority group? Because I feel like that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Again, I don't feel qualified to speak on that question. It's not. Yeah, I can speak about it from like a clinical perspective. It's like in the sense
Please,
of, yeah,
from you,
but
I would love, yeah, from that perspective.
yeah, I mean, clinically, when I hear about the employee who's resentful because of a DI initiative, I would want to interact with that client and ask what feels resentful. Where does that resentment come from? Um, because I'm guessing the resentment is it's similar to our conversation on EQ. The resentment is there, and it's being touched on around conversations around DEI, but the resentment is actually interest, not about.
See, this is what I love. Like, this is an argument I've never heard before, and about how this is could be something from within, and we should explore it. I love that. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, that's I mean that's pretty much how I think clinically about that. And I think this has been true this last political cycle. The loudest voices of racism, bigotry, hate that come out in the field I'm in, I've learned to be curious. And of
I love.
course, it's detestable. A lot of the language has even come from Trump and others in the camp. But I'm curious. And if you ask the right questions, um, I think that's where the internal work that every person can do beautiful comes in.
I think, and that's the true diversity of thought that I think is missing beyond just diversity of thought coming from different demographics. Is the diversity of thought from your fellow man, that can also be of. I mean, in some cases, I can consider myself part of a minority group, and I would say that I within this group, there's differing opinions
Mhm.
on you know social or cultural aspects of life. And I think that that nuance, as my previous guest mentioned on the podcast, the nuance, where humans are nuanced, and we should not be afraid of it. We can be upset about one thing and be happy with another thing, and it's not black and white in the sense of like there's either part of this train of thought or that train of thought. There should be some nuance, and I think it should be okay to bring that out. And just my closing art top statement on that topic. So let's talk about something that I think is very interesting, and I think, in my opinion, the part of that I can't wait to hear more, or I'm really excited about hearing your take on leadership weakness in tech.
Mm.
So you've worked in tech for years.
Mhm.
Tell us a bit more about what you did in tech before we kind of jump into your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was part of go-to-market teams, specifically in sales. So I started as a sales development representative and worked my way up the title ladder. And the last role I had was more of a consulting role, but as a strategic um, account executive position.
Okay. So, in the tech world, right now we always glorify the visionary CEO, but a lot of data shows that many of them fail due to arrogance, unrealistic expectations, or lack of self-awareness, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about. Some argue that empathy-based leadership is leading the lack of accountability, and as leaders are afraid of challenging underperforming employees. Others argue that founder syndrome is real. Visionary leaders often fail to scale the business because they resist delegation. So, this is covering several aspects of it. So,
Mhm.
what would you say is the number one psychological blind spot of tech leaders, and why does it keep happening?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's specifically on my experience in tech. And when I think leaders, I think both the frontline managers up to VP, up to C level. It goes back to the conversation around EQ, where if a leader does not understand EQ and operate with a high EQ, then they become ego driven. And what I mean by ego, I like Richard Gore's definition of ego. It's a part of us that wants us to feel superior, separate, and important. And that part of us isn't bad. But I think you can see in just naming those terms that when ego is driving my decisions, then it's going to lead to relational and organizational problems in business. Um,
Well, sometimes you see 'em out in the when you look at some of these hot tech startups that, at least from my perspective, appears as if the CEO's, let's call it ego,
mhm,
and their perception of themselves and self-importance is one of the driving factors to their success early on.
mhm.
So in a sense, wouldn't then ego be a good thing, at least early on, but then they should taper it down maybe? How do you balance that?
Yeah, so I wouldn't label ego as a good thing or a bad thing. I don't think that we all have ego. Um, I think the question, with the reason that I connect this to EQ is it's about what is examined in someone's life and what is unexamined. If um, a, a CEO has an unexamined ego, and I could name multiple leaders I worked with who fall in this camp. They're going to be making decisions based on needing to feel superior, needing to feel separate, needing to feel important. And yes, that can drive productivity, that can drive effectiveness. A lot of successful sales reps are driven by ego. What is beginning to be questioned, especially in research, and we alluded to this earlier in our conversation, is that the most effective way to increase goals within an organization? In the field of psychology and psychotherapy, we know that positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement both increase can increase desired behaviors and decrease undesired behaviors. Um, there's research on which one is better, positive or negative. Um, if a leader is looking at increasing productivity in an organization and they only think in terms of positive and negative reinforcements, motivation factors, then they're missing all kinds of other factors. And that's where this ego flaw comes into place, because the research is starting to point to human flourishing in business and in organizations is actually what increases productivity to a scale that's sustainable and most effective. So, yes, you can achieve things based on a strong ego. You can increase productivity based on ego driven measures and desiring to feel important. But is that the most effective? Is that the most sustainable? And I would argue it's not.
Okay. That's good to hear. What can you give us an example of, obviously an anonymous example of a day-to-day scenario that either an employee or a leader would see or find themselves in a workplace, and how that leader is showing poor leadership, and how they should act or be more mindful instead,
Hmm.
just so that you can give the audience some like real nuggets here as to how, just to help them be surface things up, and they're on their journey to mindfulness, and
Hmm.
how some of the things that commonly happen.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, the amount of meetings I was in with leaders who are desiring to increase productivity. And so we're having conversations around um, utilizing tools to be more efficient. We're having conversations around time management prioritization. Do we prioritize this activity or this activity? Or, and again, those all can move the needle. And those are important conversations to have. Where it's being missed is when a leader thinks that those are the only conversations that can increase productivity and effectiveness in the workplace. It's almost like I've seen leaders like swimming in a deep end and just flailing because they don't know how to swim. All they know is, let me talk about time management, use of tools, um, strategies and outreach, things like that. Human flourishing, providing an environment where somebody feels like they're growing, they're respected, These are not things that just make people feel good and increase retention. It actually increases productivity. There's a study in 2021 where uh, they looked at the combination of e-learning and career development, how that affected a larger workforce. And the takeaways were: it increases resilience, which is the ability to navigate complex situations creatively and sustainably, um, which ultimately increase productivity across this workforce. And because when you're developed in your career, when your leaders are pouring into you, it's communicating: you matter, you're important, we care about you, we see you as a whole person. Um, this is ultimately probably what was the greatest rub for me in the sales world. Was everywhere I went, I tried to advocate for my and my colleagues' overall holistic well-being, being taken care of and noticed. Um, and I had two leaders specifically that did that and had great results. Um, and that's out of probably, I don't know, 30 or 40 different leaders I engaged with in my sales career. So,
So, why would you say? How come bad leaders end up in a position of leadership?
mhm.
Why does that happen? Why
Mm,
does it keep happening?
yeah. Well, because the leaders that put them in that position of leadership don't know what to look for in a leader. Um,
What should they be looking for?
yeah, they should be looking for somebody um, who, again, and I'm taking as table stakes the skills necessary to succeed, whether it's marketing team, a sales team, a customer success team. There are certain skills and abilities that are needed. Okay, let's put those off to the side. So what makes somebody a good leader? This is somebody, again, who's connected to their internal experience. And that's not that hard to figure out in an interview process. Um, what shaped them in their life? Um, I had, I mentioned there, I've had two leaders who really brought the best out of a team. And one of those, when I was interviewing with him, said, "What's the hardest thing you've been through?" And that's such an open-ended question. And I decided to take a risk and be vulnerable and share something that I typically wouldn't share in a professional setting. And that made me realize, if I come to this organization, I'm valued, not just in the numbers that I produce, but in who I am, which is motivating. And
I love that.
while metrics are necessary and have to drive performance, um, research is showing that human flourishing increases productivity and effectiveness.
And this is in line with also my previous guest. Kind of had very similar message of just take care of the human, and then they take care of the business. I love that, and now I also think about some of. I too had two leaders that I remember that were amazing, and
Mhm,
one of them, he came to me and said, "I worked for you,
mhm,
not the other way around." I'm like, "What do you mean?"
mhm,
He's like, "No, I worked for you. My job is to make sure that you have everything you need to get your job done, to remove any obstacles out of your way, to keep the office politics out of your way, so that you can focus on nothing on just the job."
mhm,
And I thought that was brilliant. I remember it was early on, and I'm like, this is brilliant." And he proved to be one of the top leaders I had. The other leader was also, she took care of the human aspect of her team. uh, she would make sure that we paid attention to our families, and she would certain times where she would, she would even send us like cards on our birthday, or if like somebody had a kid or something.
mhm,
She paid attention to those things, but genuinely did it, not just one of those like, this is, I'm trained to do this because this is how it's going to be perceived. But you can tell, from interacting with that person on a daily basis, hours on end, when they are being genuine versus when they're being fake. And that with it changed decisions I made. Sometimes where like I might get another opportunity with marginal a bit more pay or the culture might be unknown to me. I would stick around because I knew what I had. And the saying is that you always, it's your manager is the person that you know uh, makes or breaks your job, and I agree with that. So let's talk about another thing here. In today, a lot of people argue that hustle culture is essential for high performing industries,
Mm.
and that taking breaks makes you lose your competitive edge. Others kind of talks about like nobody changed the world working 40 hours a week. You have to put in more time. You have to put in more of your soul, so to speak, to be able to uh, be competitive and get the job done. What's your take on that? Is unplugging a superpower, or is it truly just an excuse just to be lazy?
Mm. Well, we're having this conversation in the context of a society that is driven by consumer capitalist values. So, in our society, we praise productivity. Um, we think when we think of success, we think of achievements and productivity. Um, with that backdrop and that context, um, yeah, I've alluded a couple of times to research that's showing different ways and more effective ways to increase productivity. Let's pay attention to what it means to be a human in this world. Um, let's take working out. There are established realities in the world that I did not create. One of them is that, I mean, I've gotten into running the past 3 years, and I have really enjoyed it. And I've also had a few injuries because as I'm training, I can't go from nothing to running 5 miles every day. Um, I have to let my muscles rest and recover. Um, it's the same with any physical activity. Um, it's the same. I mean, when our bodies get sick, what do we? I mean, some people pride themselves in like still going when they're sick, but what our bodies are asking for is to slow down and rest. Um, we can even see this in music. I grew up playing the violin, and if you just hear notes playing all the time, like when a kid is first learning the violin, imagine that noise. It's not music. To play music, you have to know when to play a note and when to not play a note and when to rest. And so I I think the reality um of a human flourishing is to understand what does it mean to rest. And if you can't turn off stimuli, then ask the question, why not? If I have to always be going and I don't feel good when I stop, or it's uncomfortable when I stop, if I have to check email over the weekend, just ask why. And again, this is where therapy can help you explore what's happening inside of you.
I should
Please, please.
I should put your phone number right now at the bottom because if you're gonna get a lot of customers with that, I honestly like you that
Mm,
transported me to a realization that it's going back to like the whole nuance of things. Like you just
mm,
things you think are just they just are because they are just that they've been that way.
yeah.
Like people work 5 days a week. It's been throughout the modern history, but then you start to realize that you should question some of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's some you know gray area that needs to be explored here,
Yeah.
and I just never thought of it that way.
Here's the most fascinating statistic in or data point from the research around 4-day work weeks. Um, One study showed that of all the companies that trialed a 4-day work week, after the trial period was done, 92% of the companies adopted a 4-day work week. So they're certainly not going to adopt it if productivity and effectiveness is down. So it leads to the question of why. Why did they adopt it? And I'm Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's a fascinating statistic.
Yeah, it is. That's awesome. So, Chris, I liked your approach on why we need to kind of pause and to recover, just like a muscle needs to recover, and the negative side effects of a hustle culture in the sense of how it's sustainable. And I would agree, maybe I don't believe it is sustainable. So, with the next one, let's talk about kind of a forgotten tool for innovation, or kind of on the flip side of uh, the previous topic. Tell us more about how boredom
Mhm.
is a good thing, and it kind of can, in a way, tie into the whole thing about pausing. You know, if you pause and just do nothing, go relax, go for a walk. Tell us more about what boredom does in our minds and why it's now getting a lot of attention and research, and how it can tie in to positive um, targets or goals being achieved in a workplace.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's boredom is deeply connected to slowing down in our frenetic pace in our culture and in technology world, and business in particular. I mean, if we define boredom as the intentional or unintentional reduction of stimuli, um, then I mean, I think about I have young adult children in their early and mid 20s. And I wonder how many in their generation, and this is one segment, but how many in their generation over the past 365 days, the past year, when they were falling asleep, were not engaging their cell phone 15 minutes before they fell asleep. The amount of stimuli we have to engage, and the book Dopamine Nation speaks to this too, and how the dopamine release and effect trains us in a lot of our behaviors, checking email, checking social media. It gives us dopamine when we do that. Correct. Yeah, and reinforces, oh, this is something that I want to do more often, or I need to do it to feel this way.
So essentially, it's like a drug. Simulation itself can be like a drug.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So, um, I think one theme throughout our conversation today, even starting with EQ, is going back to the difference between living an examined life and living an unexamined life. And when I go for a walk, um, I live right on some hiking trails by a river in Durham. Um, and something happens when I don't take my phone, I don't take my AirPods, I don't put a podcast on, and I'm just present. Something happens. And I could name all the things that I feel the benefits of. Um, One story, I remember working in an office, um, and the power went out in my part of the office. And it was alarming to all of us how quiet it was. I didn't even realize um, that there were machines making noises that I was just used to, the consistent buzzing of that
Their white noise. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it just became part of my daily life. So, both in personal life and professional life, if we're just going and engaging and stimulating ourselves, what are we not noticing?
Ooh,
What
it's another nugget.
what are the buzzing machines in our world that, oh yeah, you know what? If I didn't have that, that would help here, or that would, um, yeah. So I think that's boredom is something. I mean, we have to be intentional about it now. We have to create space for.
And it can help increase innovation, helps you come up with thoughts and new ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not disconnected from this conversation, but there is research around um, how meditation actually increases neuroplasticity in the brain. And neuroplasticity is that experience of creating new neural connections in our brain, which gives us new creative ways to solve problems. And meditation is really about tuning our attention, um, oftentimes inward, and slowing down and being mindful.
Well, apparently some neuroscientists argue that boredom does not inherently spark creativity, but structured challenges do. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm sure structured challenges also spark creativity.
Also, and yeah, conjunction. Okay.
Yeah.
So, for closing thoughts here on the future of leadership and innovation, Chris, what would you say are the biggest mindset shift leaders need to make in today's rapidly challenging world?
Mhm. Yeah, I think we've hit on them throughout this conversation, but I think a leader needs to do their own work to live a internally connected and examined life. Because when they do that, they can not only lead and make decisions well, but be very clear about where those decisions are coming from. Um, and that, I mean, that leads to culture within the organization of people also valuing, good culture isn't everyone being nice to one another. Good culture is authentic engagement and learning how to have conflict well with other human beings. And so when a leader embodies that and it spreads throughout the organization, that becomes a place where people can take risks with innovation and ultimately leads to growth and
Yes, boss. I like that. So basically, you're saying if a culture is pushing you to have honest conversations, it's that also means doesn't mean just that you're always having an honest conversation, but it also means that in some cases that honest conversation might be a difficult one, but you should still have it
Mhm.
in order to be true to the culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that internal interconnectedness will allow you to communicate clearly in all situations.
Beautiful. So, last question here: what would you say is the kind of the most underrated leadership trait holding us back?
The most underrated leadership trait. Um, yeah,
It'd probably go back to EQ, right?
my mind does.
Well, then maybe we'll shift it. Let's say, what's the most overrated leadership trait?
Mhm. Yeah.
It feels like a better question there.
Yeah, I would say the most overrated leadership trait is um aggression and decisiveness. Um, because I think a good leader, again, one that's interconnected, can come into a situation and say, "I'm not sure what direction to go here. Let me include other voices." Um, the leader who is again ego driven is going to feel like they have to make a decision to look good and serve in the role, and so
So I like that. So basically, you're saying it's not. I would argue that leaders need to be able to make decisions, but
Mhm.
you're saying is that maybe they need to know when they need more opinions, where you have the time to factor in, to bring in more stakeholders, versus when there's a time crunch and you just have to make a decision. So you should give yourself the space to bring in different viewpoints, and also realize that it's okay to be vulnerable sometimes. So I think that's one of personally, I think one leadership trait that I've always tried to kind of, not work on or didn't even realize something you work on was to be sometimes vulnerable. It has an amazing ability to connect with people, and it's something I probably have tried to not show ever.
Mhm.
And it's something I'm being more trying to be more conscious about it.
Which comes back to EQ. You can be vulnerable when you identify what your experience is, and you can be compassionate towards it yourself. Then you can communicate and share with others.
All right. Well, Chris, I appreciate your time today. It's been a very insightful conversation, and I know that you've shared several nuggets that actually, for a second, I stopped, or I, re- I forgot that I was part of a podcast, and I started kind of going on the tangent in my head, thinking about it. Then I realized, oh, I need to come back to this because. So I probably, as I re-listen to this podcast, I'm going to be pausing and reflect on some of the words you said. Again, thank you for your unique perspective and unique background that helps give it some meat. And I look forward to hopefully one day having you on again.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
All right, take care.
All right.